Hello, everyone. This is Nathan Liu. Welcome to our Team 11B's presentation. Today, our group is presenting our project titled Impact of Rising Disaster Frequency on Housing Demand in the Gulf Coast. Our focus is on understanding how increasing disaster activity, things like hurricanes, floods, and tropical storms, is reshaping how buyers behave and how home values shift over time in this area. I'll start by walking through the big picture context before we move into our analysis. So at the high level, what we're seeing across the Gulf Coast is that disaster frequency has been rising steadily, with states like Texas and Louisiana showing some of the strongest increases. Despite this, demand for housing has remained surprisingly resilient. Buyers will continue purchasing homes, but what they value is shifting. Storms create volatility, especially hurricanes and floods, but they don't always drive prices down. In some cases, they even push them upward due to factors like insurance payouts, limited inventory, or urgency to relocate. What this means for the market is that resilience features are becoming more important. Buyers are increasingly willing to pay a premium for homes that reduce long-term risk. So for a company like Disaster Resilient Homes Inc., the opportunity is to reposition itself around safety, durability, and long-term security. Now, the problem we're addressing here is that disasters in the Gulf Coast are increasing, but builders and housing firms don't have a clear strategy for how to respond. Even though exposure risk is rising, home prices remain high and buyers continue to enter these markets. So the central question we're exploring is how does rising disaster frequency affect housing demand and home prices in the Gulf Coast? So to answer that, we analyze both the frequency and types of disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and so on, across five Gulf Coast states. Our dependent variable is the average home price, which lets us measure how buyer behavior shifts in response to different types of risks. This connects directly to the marketing process framework, especially the steps of capturing value and delivering value. Now, to ground our project within the marketing framework, we focused on how disaster trends affect both the capturing and delivering of value. Capturing value relates to how pricing and demand shifts in response to risks, while delivering value focuses on what features or attributes a home builder needs to emphasize in a changing environment. As disasters increases, the traditional selling points, things like lifestyle, location, or square footage, become less central. Instead, buyers begin prioritizing resilience, things like flood-resistant construction, elevated foundations, or stronger wind-rated materials. So the marketing opportunity is really about repositioning. Housing firms that understand how risks shape buyer psychology can offer products that directly address those concerns. And that's the lens we used throughout our analysis. Perfect. With that context in mind, we'll now walk through the methods we used to analyze the data.
For our analysis, we used two main data sets, FEMA's disaster declarations and Zillow's housing prices for the Gulf Coast states. We cleaned and standardized both so we could merge them by state and year, fixing formatting issues, handling missing values, and making sure the timelines lined up. Once the data was ready, we started with basic visualizations like line charts and bar charts. We ran correlations to see if certain disaster types were tied to price changes. We then tested a multiple linear regression to see whether disaster frequency or storm types predicted home prices. That model didn't explain much, even after trying a log transformation. So we moved to a random forest model, which is better at picking up nonlinear patterns and interactions. In the end, this approach helped us answer two key questions. Do disasters affect housing demand? And if they do, which factors matter most? When we look at disaster frequency over time, the main pattern is clear. Events in the Gulf Coast are becoming more frequent and more volatile. Some years spike sharply, but overall the trend moves upward, especially after 2017. Texas and Louisiana stand out the most. They see the biggest jumps, mainly from hurricanes, tropical storms, and floods. Since these states have large populations and strong housing demand, even moderate increases in storm activity can ripple through prices, inventory, and insurance markets. The key takeaway is these aren't just random one-off events. The Gulf Coast is facing a steady rise in disasters, and that's putting long-term pressure on housing markets, insurance costs, and how buyers think about risk. When we compare disaster activity with home prices, the relationship isn't simple, and that's actually one of the most interesting findings. For tropical storms, we see a strong positive correlation with prices. After moderate storms, insurance payouts, urgency to relocate, and reduced supply can temporarily push prices up. Severe storms behave differently. Those tend to lower prices because buyers expect repairs and higher insurance costs. Even then, the drop isn't dramatic, which shows that these markets bounce back quickly. What's also important is what we didn't find. Most other disaster types barely affect prices at all. Their correlations are small and inconsistent across states. So overall, buyers seem to react mainly to frequent, recurring risk rather than isolated events. That helps explain why demand in the Gulf Coast stays strong, even as disaster frequency increases.
Before we built our regression model, we checked whether our variables met the assumptions needed for linear regression, mainly the normality test. When we looked at the original data distributions, the home price data and the disaster frequency were clearly skewed to the right, as confirmed also by the QQ plots, where the observations are not in a straight line. Moving on to the log transformation, so as to uh, achieve normality, we can see after performing log transformation, now data frequency on the histogram visual can be seen that it's approximately normal, and it's confirmed with the QQ plots. All the observations are now in the straight line, almost in the straight line, as well as the average home price. Same thing, all the observations are almost in the straight line. Moving on to the regression model, we can see that the model didn't capture patterns in the data even after adjusting the variables and trying the log transformed version. The linear model still didn't perform well, as shown by the R squared, which was extremely low, approximately 2%, meaning the predictors were not explaining much of the variation at all. And also, all the coefficients are not significant, as shown by the p-values, which are all greater than 0.05. That's likely because the relationship between disasters and house prices is not linear, which led us to explore a non-linear model, which is random forest regression model. Moving on to the random forest regression model. So random forest nonlinear model is better on picking up interactions and complex relationships. In this model, disaster frequency came out as the most important predictor. State indicators also played a major role. For example, Florida had high predictive weight because buyers there are especially sensitive, to hurricane activity. This model basically helped us to understand not just if disasters affect prices, but which variables play the biggest role in shaping demand. So when we interpret the random forest results, a few key insights stand out. First, higher disaster frequency tends to weaken demand stability. More frequent storms create more volatility in the market. Second, the level of exposure varies by state, and that changes how buyers react. For example, Florida's response to storms look different from Mississippi's or Alabama's. So from marketing perspective, this reinforces the idea that resilient homes deliver value because they reduce long-term risk for buyers. So moving on to the key interpretation.
Okay, so putting everything together, this slide experienced what the random forest model tells us. First, even though disasters in the Gulf Coast are becoming more frequent, the housing market in these states has stayed surprisingly strong. Buyers are not running away. Instead, they are learning how to navigate the risk, and in a lot of cases, they adapt random to retreat. Second, most disaster types don't have a huge, consistent impact on prices. hurricanes and floods are the ones that stand out the most. That means buyers are selective in the risks they actually respond to. And third, our random forest model really supports the idea that overall disaster frequencies is the biggest driver of housing patterns. It matters more than individual storm types, and it explains why states like Florida and Texas show stronger reactions. And move to the business and marketing perspective. These insights have pretty clear implications. If a company like this disaster resilient homes wants to stay competitive in the Gulf Coast, it can just sell lifestyle or location anymore. It has to communicate safety and long-term security. That means promoting features like elevated foundations, resistant materials, backup power, or anything that's reduce repair cost after storm. Another implication is the importance of trust. Buyers want transparencies about risk, insurance expectations, and what a home is built to withstand. First, that can clearly communicate those things are going to win more customer loyalty. Okay, let's focus on business actions. Managers should prioritize risk mitigation features in design and marketing. Homes should be positioned as safe and resilient investments, not just lifestyle products. This requires shifting that the value proposition from location and lifestyle to safety and resilience. By doing this, firms can maintain demand in high-risk regions and partner with insurance to offer the bundle coverage. This strategy builds customer trust, enables premiums pricing, and supports a stronger long-term.
Based on everything we found, we put together a set of marketing recommendations that a company like Disaster Resilient Homes can actually act on. The biggest theme is repositioning the brand as a risk mitigation partner instead of just a traditional home builder. Buyers in the Gulf Coast want to feel protected, so leaning into resilience as part of the brand identity is really important. On the product side, firms should highlight specific resilience features, things like stronger roofing materials, water-resistant foundations, elevated structures, and even energy resilience like solar plus backup batteries. These features don't just look good on paper, but buyers in high-risk states truly value them. We also recommend offering bundled value through partnerships. For example, teaming up with insurance companies to provide discounted premiums for resilient homes can make buyers feel more secure and reduce long-term costs. And finally, firms should be more transparent by sharing clear risk assessments or certifications so customers know exactly what protections they're getting. The idea is to turn resilience into a real selling point, not an afterthought. Building on the limitations we mentioned earlier, it is also important to acknowledge that our data set doesn't fully capture the human side of housing decisions. Things like buyer psychology, community ties, or local political decisions can all influence how people respond to disasters, but they're not reflected in FEMA or Zillow data. Another limitation is that disaster severity isn't measured perfectly. For example, a state might have 10 minor storms or one extremely destructive hurricane, but our frequency variable treats them similarly. That can blur some of the nuance in how disasters truly affect housing markets. And lastly, because random forest models rely on historical patterns, they don't always reflect how markets might react to future climate scenarios where storms become more intense or more frequent. So, while our findings are strong for the time period we studied, they shouldn't be interpreted as long-term forecasts. They're more like snapshots of how the market behaves right now. Overall, our project shows that rising disaster frequency isn't just a challenge, it's also shaping a new kind of value in the Gulf Coast housing market. Instead of discouraging buyers, disasters are pushing them to prioritize safety, durability, and long-term security. For housing firms, that means the opportunity lies in designing and marketing homes that address those needs directly. The key takeaway is that resilience itself has become part of the value proposition. Homes that protect buyers from future risks aren't just safer, they're more marketable, and they maintain stronger demand even with increasing climate uncertainty. And finally, here are our references. Our data came from FEMA's disaster declaration summaries and Zillow's country-level home value dataset. These sources provided the foundation for all our analysis and helped us build a clearer picture on how disasters and housing markets interact across the golf course. Thank you.